So. Thanks very much, Eugenio. Thanks for coming to this early hour in this last day. I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to share some thoughts and some games actually with you, and I'm in particular thankful to Eugenio because when he asked me for a keynote and I said to him, oh, what do you think would be interesting? And he said something like, speak about composing, speak about music. Huh? Something like this. So I try this. I would like to speak about two subjects this morning. One subject is the relationship between listening and creating music. Listening to music and creating music. I will play a game today with you, hopefully, in which I consider composition mainly as a continuation of listening. And the second subject will be the relationship between creating music and coding in Csound. So I will ask, and I will code a little bit, and you will see the code, and I will ask, I will try to observe myself, and with your help, later we can have a talk about it. Is the process of coding quite straightforward, or are there any clumsinesses or something which is really something quite remote from what we want to do as composers? Okay, so this is about listening, it's about creating, it's about coding, and it's about music. But what is music? I personally like very much an old story from Greece, 2000 something years ago, in which claims to explain the origin of music, how music starts. And the story is like this, that someone walked around and suddenly he stumbled. And then a sound arose, and this man stopped and listened and looked down, and there was a turtle, a dead turtle, lying on the back, and the sun had already dissolved the flesh, but some sinews were not dissolved. So in the moment of this stumbling, it was like a plucked string. So this was the reason for the sound, and the person took the turtle, held it in his arm and plucked again. So the Greek harp, the kitara, was born. And this is the origin of music. And I think it's true. This is the origin of music. Because there are very important aspects in this story which proves this. First is the ability to be astonished. It is the moment when you have an accident and you do not just kick this damned thing away and curse it, but you can listen. You can be astonished, you can be surprised. In this moment, the sound is in your mind, the sound is what fills you, what is the whole reality for you. And this is the first point. The second point is that it has to do with a stop, and it has to do with something new which comes in reality, which comes to existence. Before there was no music, but in this moment the music really comes to life. And it has something to do with not to continue this way we are used. It has to do with stopping and concentrating completely to this listening. And the third aspect is that it's not enough just to say, okay, this was a beautiful sound, and then go on, but to do something, to take this material, to take this sound-producing body and repeat it. And of course then a new step begins. It begins the question, for instance, when this person plucks two strings, you will recognize this is not the same pitch, so how can I tune this? How can I rebuild this body, which was in a way random at this first meeting? How can I build it in a way that I can shape the sound more? So we have 3 steps, and we know, for instance, in programming the kind of loops that we have, for instance, the read, eval, print loop. And here I think we can also speak of a loop. We can say we have a listen, figure out, and work loop. First, we listen to something, we try to figure out what the sound requires, what the sound wants us to do, and then we work. And as a result, we have a new sound, and again, we listen, we try to figure out, and we work, and so on. So, in a way, I will now start the game, and in a way it's a continuation of Richard's talk yesterday, because I will prove that in half an hour you can compose a wonderful piece. And the game starts with the most simple sound, I think, in electronic music, with a sine. So I will start the game with playing a sine tone of 2 seconds. And the first question, and please try to make your own assessment, the first question is, what does this sound want us to do? First, I forgot, I have to code the sound, so it's now the beginning of coding. I use here the wonderful Csound Python bridge from François Pinault, also using some parts of Andrés Cabrera's ICSound. So I already started an instance here of ICSound. And now with this Csound magic, I can just send any code. For instance, I can write an instrument sine. What do I have when I want to produce a sine tone? I need a duration. I already decided this should be 2 seconds. And I need a pitch, and I need a volume. So I say, okay, my pitch is as MIDI note. I will use the middle D, so it's MIDI note 62, and the volume in decibel should be -12. And then I produce the sine with a precise oscillator, and I transform the decibel to amplitude, and the pitch MIDI to frequency, and then the output. So that's my instrument. I evaluate it, and sorry? No, it's possible to do it like this. When you have 2 channels, and you can write, even when you have 8 channels, you just write out. It's one of the many things which are now easier in Csound, thanks to Victor and the other developers. So now the game starts. I will play 2 seconds of this tone, and you try to figure out what this sound requests, what this sound wants you to do. It's not the seminar here, it's a keynote, so sorry that I give you my own assessment. What the sound wants me to do is, yes, technically an envelope, but it's more like the sound is not happy with the way it comes to life and it dies. And the question is, okay, 1 envelope, 2 envelopes, 3 envelopes, 4 envelopes. My feeling is 2 is good. So I decided to have 2 envelopes. The first one is like the messa di voce, so in a soft crescendo e diminuendo. A little bit more technically, it would look like this. So we have a rise of the volume and decibel over time and a decay. And the second envelope, I decided the sound wants to have a percussive thing like a pluck. So it is an exponential fall of the amplitude over time. So these are the 2 things I want now to realize in Csound. And one thing is important to consider, that we have now two types, 2 species. And it is like in nature that we have, for instance, cats and dogs, and these are clearly distinguished, these species, but everyone knows how different is one dog from another and how different is one cat from another. So we should always try, in my opinion, to reproduce this natural variety, these variants, when we write computer music. In nature, it's easy, because nature itself has these deviations. But of course, in computer music, it's so easy to have an identical replicate, and we can find easy ways to get out of it. First, what I mean is, for instance, from the messa di voce, we can have different shapes. These are 4 examples, and we see that we have actually 2 parameters which are different now. First is the peak point in time. Here it is at the beginning of the sound, and here it's at the end, here it's at the middle. And the second parameter is the difference between the start and end point and the maximum. So here it's big, here it's small. So with these analysis of what is possible, I can make my choice. For instance, I can say, okay, the minimum and maximum peak time should be something like between 1/3 and 2/3. And the maximum peak level should be 40 decibel above the start and end point, and the minimum should be 20. So how is it to write in Csound? This is the code. So we have the first lines are identical to what we already saw. And then I say, okay, the peak ratio is a random value between 1/3 and 2/3 here. And the peak decibel difference is between 20 and 40. That's what is here. And then we calculate the decibel at start and end. We create a line with 2 segments here. And the rest is what we had, only that I apply a very small fade in, fade out at the beginning. So I evaluate it, and let's listen now to 4 realizations of these general setting of limits. So you hear these are slight differences, but these are differences. It's not an identical reproduction. And when I decide to have the minimum peak point earlier and the maximum later and so on, I will get more differences in the shape of the sound. So what about the second envelope? Actually, it's only the steepness which is the parameter, except the duration, of course, which is always an important point. I will get back later to it. So if you know Csound, you know this is the transec opcode actually, and this is what we call the type variable. So when I have a negative type, I have this shape, and when it's a bigger number like -10, it is a more banded, and if it's nearly zero, if it's zero, it's a straight line, and if it's a small negative value, it's nearly a straight line. So how is the code in Csound again? Let's look, and you see I translate this as a random choice again, and I have my decibel and pitch as I had, and all I do is now I apply the transec opcode. So here this is identical, and all is additional is the type as input. Let's also here listen to 4 variants with different types. I think the differences are even slighter now, and it is more important for the percussive tone to think about duration. And that's actually quite interesting when we consider we have now 2 characters, and we should think about which durations are possible, which are required, or possible is a better word here. So for the messa di voce, I would say it can be quite long, for instance 10 seconds. It can be something like 3 seconds. And 1 second, in my opinion, is something like the minimum. When I have, for instance, 1/10 second, it loses its character of a messa di voce. This is quite different for the percussive tone. It can also be, for instance, 3 seconds. 10, in my opinion, is too long. It can be 1 second, so it shares this with the other one. But it can be definitely shorter. And even it can be 1/100th of a second. Then it changes, of course, the color. It gets noisy, but this is definitely an emanation of the percussive character. So we have different materials now, and this is only when we consider one isolated being of these types, of the 2 types. It gets more interesting and more diverse when we consider a sequence. Usually these tones do not want to be alone. Imagine a sound installation with only 1 tone quite alone. This will usually not happen, except the tone is in itself very interesting, but that's not our case here. So first I consider the percussive tone, and I wrote a sequence of it, and we will now ask for the parameters to consider in this group of tones. This was a scattered sequence of tones, I can write an, I can code, or I can create a metric one instead. Sorry, it gets me a little bit to come into this. It could be easier, but let's play it again. It's definitely metric. Oops. Oh, that's it. The new dimension, actually, this percussive tone brings up when there are groups of this simple thing is rhythm. The question is now, which kind of rhythm? Is it irregular? Is it metric? How dense it is? What are the internal volumes in this rhythm? And so on and so on. The direction of the Messa di Voce material is, in my opinion, quite different. This could be a simple sequence of some Messa di Voce notes, tones, and when I play it I will play it now in two ways. The first way is with the same pitch. By the way, we always had the same pitch here the whole time in this percussive tone. I will do the same for the Messa di Voce sequence, and then I will have different pitches, slightly different pitches. So. For me, it requires actually this pitch deviation. It needs it. And this opens up the dimension of pitch. This means, what do I use? Do I use a chromatic scale? Do I use a quarter tone scale? Do I use, for instance, partial relations from 32 to 64th partial? Or do I use a pentatonic scale? Or whatever. And, of course, what is the direction of the pitches? Is it a rising sequence? Is it a falling sequence? Is it like here, that it's all related to a central note? So many questions, and we have to answer them when we compose. So this is what I wanted to show with this very simple example, and with a way of loop, which means we do something, we listen to it, we try to figure out what are the dimensions, what are the potentials of this material, and then we do it, and then we listen again. It is, for me, quite interesting how complex it is, even with such a very, very simple and restricted material. Personally, I'm easily overwhelmed by the possibilities, and then it helps that as a composer, it's good to know the possibilities, but of course you must decide, and this is your fantasy which decides one of the possibilities, and just do it, like the mythic person did by taking the turtle and plugging it. So I wrote a little piece about 2 minutes long, and I will play it for you. It's only with these two characters, and this is my proof, as I mentioned. So I wrote also a score. Actually, I personally would suggest not to look at the score, but to listen to the music. But if you like, you can also look at the score. So, what's the time? How much is left? 20 minutes left. I mean, I can go back now perhaps a little bit to the second question to observe how was coding, because this is a little bit more complex than the simple examples I did. And then I suggest either we can speak about this general approach of listening, figuring out, working, composing actually, or we can also speak about the way of coding. So I go back to coding. This means I tell you what I found straightforward and what I miss. So in general, maybe you agree, otherwise you would not be here, and I think you agree also when we look back at what I did here in coding, that's really straightforward to say, okay, I want this and I do it. I just write a line of code and that's it. And what I think we all love in Csound is that we are able to shape really details. It's wonderful that we have an endless ability of working in every detail of the sound. Also, we don't need to know a lot of programming paradigms and so on. We can just say, do this, do this, do this. What I miss, for instance, I have this code here in the Messa di Voce instrument, and I would, when I call this instrument, it gets easily to lines like this. Huh? You all will know it. It can be in a traditional score, or it can be in a schedule line. So we have a kind of anonymous sequence of parameters. And what I really miss is that I can set default values to parameters. Maybe the syntax can be like this or can be different. So I say the I pitch MIDI is P4 and the default is 70. And the I peak decibel is P5 and the default is -6. And then I would love to be able to call an instrument and only to specify the parameters which are different, which is of course possible in for instance, Python. And the other parameters would be taken from the default values. Currently, I don't know, it's possible in Csound, maybe I overlooked something, but I don't know. And currently I have two choices. One choice is this anonymous series of numbers, which we can easily mess up, or what I usually do is I take the instrument code and copy it with some changes. For instance, here you see I have accelerando phase here and retardando here. So there is a different number, for instance, of notes and different volume and so on. But here, this way of producing it is the same in the next instrument. And this is, of course, not nice as a programmer. I could use a macro, but in my opinion, that's not nicer. So this is the main point I miss in current Csound, and the other point is that I'm not able to pass arrays to instruments. So working with arrays, which is in many ways now, as you see here, easy and nice. But the way to exchange arrays between instruments is for me a big challenge, and actually it's currently more difficult than to work with function tables, because we can give a name to function tables and they have a number, and I can refer to this number in sending it to an instrument and getting it.
So these are actually the two things which, in my experience in working, are most, well, not straightforward, as most of the other things are. Okay, so this was what I wanted to share with you. So again, I say it's two quite different things. One is the general approach to composition. If you like, I'm very happy to get opinions and criticism about this or other suggestions. And the second one is the way to code it in Csound. Thank you.